so much, Rich. I appreciate it. And Sherry, thanks
Thank
for
you.
making the time to be with us. I really value what you added to our discussion. I mean, that's really nice. And that you didn't say that we were crazy. That was my fear, was you would go like, they took forever.
No, my time as AE became really long because
I know.
But thank you also for not giving up on us in the process too, for sticking with us and helping us get there.
Absolutely.
Well, it was clear from your responses that you were being very thoughtful in the whole process. So you never want to give up on that.
Thank you, and welcome to today's episode of the Academy of Management Review Origin Series. My name is Rich McAdock. I'm an associate editor at AMR and your host for the series. And today I'll be interviewing Abby Shipp and Hetty Richardson about their forthcoming AMR article called The Impact of Temporal Schemata, Understanding When Individuals Entrain versus Resist or Create Temporal Structure. Abby is a department chair and the M.J. Neely Professor of Management at Texas Christian University. And Hetty is Associate Dean and Professor also at Texas Christian University. So please join me in welcoming Hetty and Abby. And along with Hetty and Abby today, we also have Sherry Thatcher, the current editor-in-chief of AMR, who was also the associate editor in charge of this manuscript and who accepted it. And so she'll be able to give us an editor's perspective on the review process. So welcome, ladies. Thank you for being part of the Origin series.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
So I was going to start by saying, shame on me for being about 2 minutes late for the interview with the organizational behavior field's leading expert on time. So bad form for me. But what tell us a little bit maybe about the paper, but also about how it fits into the OB field's research on time, and maybe a little bit about how you got interested in researching time in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, don't think that I didn't, think about you being 2 minutes late. No, kidding. I became interested in time as a doctoral student, and really kind of it was inadvertent, actually. I was looking at other subjects, and it was my advisor, Jeff Edwards, who said, you keep thinking about time issues no matter what we talk about. This paper, believe it or not, the original idea came to me as a doctoral student in 2005.
Wow.
I know, long time to get it to fruition, but in 2005, there was a great article by Joe LaBianca and some colleagues, LaBianca, Moon, and Watt, and they talked about, when is an hour not 60 minutes? And
right, I remember that paper. Joe was a colleague of mine at Emory.
Perfect. So I thought that is so interesting. It's so true. Why do we start things on the hour, the half hour, as opposed to, the middle of of something? And it just stuck with me. And I thought, the thing is, I think there's more to temporal schemata than just these hours. And kind of had always had an interest in that. And then, just kept chewing on it in the back of my head. Meanwhile, studying other issues about time. Initially, I was very interested in what I would call more objective time things, the clock, the calendar, schedules, time management, how things changed if we followed, for example, in my research, person environment fit, if we looked at it over a longer period of time. But then I really became more interested probably in the last 5 to 10 years on the subjective aspects. So things that individuals differed in their interpretation of time. So what, something meant to you in terms of time was different than what it meant to me. And so this temporal schemata idea kept coming up, and that it seemed like people had views of time that things seemed right, what I call early versus late. So, in my family, it's always, 5 minutes early is on time.
Mhm.
Whereas other people, showing up 2 minutes late, of course, is on time. Maybe you've got a 10-minute buffer with your perspective. So I really wanted to explore how people thought about time and how that impacted what they did in organizations. So that's the broad genesis of this idea. And like I said, it just kind of cooked in the background for years until I could really figure out, this isn't just something that we think about, but what organizational problem are we solving by knowing this?
Right.
That was a key part.
So the paper itself is kind of about the consequences of these schemata,
That's
not
right.
so much about the origins of them. But if I may digress for a moment, just to kind of ask about the origins, where do these schemata come from? Like, I mean, I know there, we know from kind of stereotypical, stereotypes in the culture that, maybe certain national cultures have different stereotypical orientations toward time. If you show up at 10 a.m. for a 10 a.m. meeting in certain countries, then people will laugh at you because, they don't start showing up until 10, 15 minutes later or half an hour later. And other, I moved to the Midwest from the South. And I definitely noticed that, when I was at Emory in the South, I would show up on time for a meeting, and I would be the only person in the room for the first few minutes. But here in the Midwest, if I show up for a meeting on time, the meeting has really already started. So tell us a little bit about, where do these, is it just cultural? Is there a personality aspect to it? Where do schemata come from?
I'm so glad you asked, because that's actually the original paper that we wrote, which is all about temporal schemata.
That's the paper that got deleted in the review process or something?
That is correct. My initial submission was completely rejected, which Sherry could talk about that. And we did start over, which is how we got to the paper today. So I'm happy to talk about that process, but just stopping for a second to think about where these come from. This was the problem that was nagging me. What are they and where do they come from? Is there a cultural element? Absolutely. But within cultures, what we also know is that, people's families, that primary socialization, and I mean very primary, right? So Hetty and I had this discussion while working on the paper. I was really resonating with, for example, we had a meeting, a leadership meeting where our dean said, okay, we're going to meet from 5 to 9 p.m. to do this faculty evaluation. And of course, my hackles went up and said, what, this is crazy. That's really late. It's after hours. What are we doing? Hetty didn't have that reaction. And I said, why are we having a different interpretation of what is a work day? And she said, well, when I was growing up, my parents, I think your mom was a teacher. Is that right, Hetty? So she was always doing work at night or on the weekends. I said, oh, interesting. My dad was a banker. My mom was a nurse. When they came home from work, that was it. So what a work day means to me, it became more segmented for me, that I may take a meeting after 5, but good grief, don't ask me to meet after 6. Now, if I choose to work after 6, that's fine. But to me, there's, what that day means really is impacted by the way I grew up in my childhood. My very first job, for example, I worked at Boeing. We tracked our time to the 10th of the hour. Mm-hmm. So I became hyper aware of time, another element of being on time. So, starting things on the hour, the half hour, I'm super aware of those things. So it seems like there are really early influences based on your family, based on your early career, your profession. All those things matter. And then because we're so influenced by these things, so what is an hour, what is a day, a week, et cetera. For me, a work week is a Monday through Friday. For Hetty, because the way she grew up, it's much more fluid. So the thing is, once you get that early family and cultural influence, the early career influence, what we have found is that temporal schemata are unlikely to change, right? Mm-hmm. Because now you see the world through this view, and anything else that's opposite of it seems wrong. So if I go into a job where they're asking for evening meetings, weekend meetings, I do this all the time, actually, in academia. it feels like, what is wrong with these people? You know, why are they asking for a meeting in the evening? Why do these people expect a response, you know, over the weekend? Because in my worldview, that's what's right, what's wrong. So that became very interesting, I think, to think about how individuals varied. And then if that's the case, what happens when we all come to an organization and try to coordinate our efforts?
Right. Well, clearly there are some personality dimensions to this, right? I mean, even something as oversimplified and simplistic as the Myers-Briggs, right, has the J versus P dimension, which has a lot to do with the person's orientation towards time.
Sure, and
creates-
we didn't talk about personality in the paper, but I think, you know, things like conscientiousness absolutely would make you a little bit more aware of time, and particularly that efficient use of your time. Like I said, we moved away from some of the you know, just understanding what schemata are. There's been a little bit of research in psychology about this as well. But it was much more important for us to establish, look, people have different ways of viewing time, and then how does that impact what they're doing at work?
So this is a constant tension for me and my family, because I have an orientation toward time where I'm not so focused on fixed schedules, right? If I'm involved in a particular project, I tend to stay focused on that, regardless of what other things come up in my calendar. And that creates all kinds of tension between me and my wife, who's very much here's the schedule, we're sticking to the schedule. And, you know, when will you be home and when will you be leaving and what, you know, and, you know, and yet it is, I think you make the point in the paper that these schemata do tend to be situational, because if you take me and my wife to Disney World, right? One time we did this, and I got this book. This was many years ago. This book called the Unofficial Guide to Disney World, and it had a touring plan in it for how you could do the entire Magic Kingdom in one day. But you had to get up at 6 a.m. You had to be there right when the gates open, and you had to follow their plan exactly to avoid all the lines and minimize your wait times and all that. And I was absolutely on board with doing that in Disney World, but don't make me do that at home, right?
That's really interesting. Yeah, I do think situation matters. You know, clearly I can operate within an academic system where stuff is happening all times of day, all, you know, over the weekend, et cetera. You can adapt. You may not do that forever, right? And so if you were asked to work at Disney World and have, you know, some sort of a long-term plan that didn't fit you, clearly that's going to resonate with you, and you're going to have to make sense of that. And so, yes, it is situation specific, keeping in mind though that your foundation for what you think is the real life, right? So not the temporary trip to Disneyland, but what's real and methodical. And so to your point, you know, does this cause a difference of opinion with the people that we are around the most, whether our significant others or our coworkers? Absolutely. And sometimes in ways that we don't know, right? So sometimes people are introspective enough to say, this is how I like to work and where and when. Other times people just plow ahead and don't talk about it.
Right.
If I could jump in just really quickly, I think this is one of the things that I really like about this paper and about this topic. And so when we started, you referred to Abby as like the foremost expert on time and organizational behavior. And when I joined this paper, I was the least most expert on time and organizational behavior. And I think, you know, when you start talking about things like a temporal schemata, it may sound very esoteric. And like, how does this really matter in the real world to real people? But your example that you gave, Rich, is perfect, because I think once you start looking at the world through this lens, or thinking about it through this lens of temporal schemata, and what are people's perceptions of what's the right time, what's the wrong time, then you start to see it applies to everything. There is some practical component where it matters in almost anything that you can think of.
Yeah, and I wanted to just to that point, just wanted to briefly show Abby's LinkedIn page here with her background being multiple clocks in the background there. So clearly clearly a strong aspect of the identity there as a researcher. But I think you're right, Hetty. That is one thing I did find fascinating about the paper. Now, Abby mentioned that the idea for this paper was kind of born in her mind as a doctoral student. So Hetty, can you maybe tell us a little bit about what attracted you to the project, at what point you were brought in, and what role you've played on the project, and then also maybe just give us an overview of the paper as it currently exists. What is the elevator pitch for this paper? You know, who should be interested in it and why?
So ironically, I think it was just very serendipitous timing that got me involved in this paper. So I think Abby asked me precisely because I am okay with going to meetings between 5 and 9 at night. But she happened to come and talk to me about this topic. And this was long after, right, she was graduated from doctoral school. She came and talked to me about it. And I just happened to be struggling with an empirical paper at the time where we were talking about, me and my co-authors were talking about, well, how do so everything we study is temporally bound. Mm-hmm. But how do you figure out what is the right time for the phenomena that you're studying?
Right.
We have no theory around that whatsoever. And you know what? Somebody really needs to create some theory around that. And so I was absorbed in this world when Abby came and talked to me about this. And obviously the paper that we ended up publishing is not really about, right, when do phenomena happen in terms of, doing research. But I do think ultimately it can be applied to that to some extent. But that was when I started to realize, right, just how important this time aspect is, and that I wanted to understand more about it. And so that this seemed like a great avenue for me to do that. And as I said with my previous comment, then once I started that, I started to see how this applies to so many of the things that I'm interested in research. I'll let Abby give the elevator.
Yeah, and actually it's great because I get to segue from what you said, which is basically the paper started as this idea of we need to be able to predict when is the right time. And the paper I wanted to write originally was, if we understand schemata, we can predict when you should do something. When should you schedule those weekly meetings? When should you schedule a kickoff of a project, et cetera? I kind of still want to write that paper. So but what this paper became, so as I mentioned, we first submitted it to AMR in 2016, and that paper was rejected, rightfully so. Because it was basically, it kind of reminds me of, the garbage can model. It was a solution in search of a problem. One of the things we heard from the reviewers, there was one sentence in that paper, and it said basically this could apply to entrainment. But I'm not an entrainment scholar per se. Of course, I know that literature, but I'm individual. I like to get in people's heads. And what the reviews said was basically, I think you're onto something, but it's about entrainment. And I think, I stomped my feet and told Hetty, I don't want to write an entrainment paper, least of all, because that's not my expertise. I'm not an organizational level coordination expert. So what this paper became, and then let me tell you the pitch, and then we can describe kind of how we got there, is that we have a disconnect between understanding how individuals think about time and how organizations coordinate time with their temporal structures. And that entrainment literature and coordination literature has absolutely focused on, look, if we don't have coordination, create stronger temporal structures, make the deadlines more clear, make the routines more obvious. And yet there are all these indications that there are times in which entrainment either isn't happening or isn't quite as perfect or complete as we would think it should be. And so what we said is, this temporal schemata help us understand why. So entrainment isn't all or nothing. It can be different types of entrainment. Maybe I entrain because I have to, but in the long term, I'm not going to sustain that. And so there's this other element of also short-term entrainment versus long-term entrainment, meaning entrainment may not be sustained. And another thing we talk a lot about in the paper is, entrainment tends to give, sort of this view that entrainment is behavioral, so you are entrained through your behaviors, but what are you thinking about while that's happening? And we have a lot of different scenarios in which we indicate that if what your organization is asking you to do in terms of a temporal structure doesn't match your temporal schemata, that comparison and mismatch, that you may have feelings about that, resentments about that. Me at that 5 to 9 p.m. meeting, like, this isn't work time. I don't want to do this, but I had to entrain because my dean asked for the meeting. So what can you say? So there may be some cognitions or affect that the entrainment literature didn't address. So it was really connecting what we know about individuals and their engagement with time with what we know about organizations and how they structure their time, and really getting that literature to talk to each other.
That's a really fascinating story in at least two ways. Number one is, I think you point out one thing that AMR does really well, which is finding the hidden gem in a paper, right? Finding that little diamond in the rough of, the rest of this paper we're not that thrilled with, but you know what? This one sentence, you could make a whole paper out of that one sentence.
That's right.
That is something that AMR does particularly well with the developmental reviewing ethos.
And I will say, I think it's pretty rare to get a full rejection and start over. I think, it's risky. It was risky for me. Because I think I was maybe maybe the year prior to, no, it was just a year after tenure. Risky because of the time, if nothing else. And so I had to email Sherry and say, we have this idea. It's to create a completely new paper based on this one thing. You're not giving us an indication of whether or not it would be successful or not, but we just want to let you know that's kind of what we're thinking. And then, of course, when she saw the paper, she had to verify, is it unique enough? Is it different? And so, and she said that it was. I don't know if she wants to add in anything here, but it was a complete starting over. And oftentimes what I've seen in my other papers I've submitted, or now being an AE at AMR, is usually, if you've got that nugget, hopefully you get an R&R in the first round, not a rejection. I mean, we literally had to start from scratch.
Right.
And that's, it was an uphill climb.
And unlike other journals, AMR does not have the reject and resubmit option, right? So,
that's right.
So Sherry, can you maybe tell a little bit about what this phase of the paper's development was like from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so I think after the first submission, and then when it was rejected, from my perspective, like, we're done. The paper was submitted, it got rejected, and that is, that's the end of the paper. And, I think Abby reached out to me and said, well, there's a piece in here, and, we'd like to kind of explore that further, but are we going to be able to send it back to AMR? And I said, well, we have, this very strict policy, right? You can't just take the paper and change a few things here or there. I mean, generally it has to look and smell and feel like a whole new paper. And oftentimes people try to shove things in or to kind of take a piece out and then shove something else in. But when you look at it, it doesn't feel quite right. And so what Abby and Hetty did is they didn't, like she said, they rewrote the whole paper, right? And if you're going to do that, you're basically saying, we have this idea now, and in order to build out that idea, we can't go back to the original assumptions or the original language or the original model. We have to build it from this nugget. And that's what they did.
And that's great. And so the other aspect of the story that I thought was fascinating was the like you said, the stomping of the feet of saying, I'm not an entrainment person, right? That's too macro for me. I'm a more micro person. I'm inside the head, and how you actually took the entrainment literature and brought it into the head, right? You made it cognitive.
Yeah.
Right? You made it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you're looking at the finished product.
Right.
And I think there's a long path between where we started and where we ended up. And those were some of the challenges that we had through the revision process. And probably, I think, why we got so many revisions was trying to navigate that in a way that you could speak to both audiences when oftentimes they use different language, they have different it's a challenge and an opportunity in our area, and that we don't have a lot of we don't have any capital T theories of time. We don't have an established introduction. Oh, let me frame this with this literature that you already know. The minute I start talking about temporal schemata, I have to pull in literature you've never heard about. And so there was, needing to build that scaffolding to get the reader to understand where you're coming from, while at the same time talking to micro and macro scholars. That was pretty challenging, I would say. And so I would say that was the key feedback that we got every round was, you need greater theoretical coherence here. You need greater clarity. You need more, connect us to something that we know. And each time that we did that, ironically, we got a little bit more embedded in the entrainment literature, and the temporal schemata kept getting smaller and smaller. So that's why I was laughing when you said, where do these things come from? Let's talk about them. We're like,
yes.
Oh, yes, finally somebody
cares, and it's a strategy guy.
The part that I love. Yeah, but
and Abby was exactly right though. It's really hard. It was hard to find the right path. Is how do we bring the individual into the organization? And for a long time, we even struggled with trying to do we take this paper and frame it in meso terms?
Yes.
And I think we both actually stomped our feet at that more than we did the macro side of things.
Yeah.
But
one thing I will take from this paper, now that I can look back on it, is how hard it is for individual level scholars to bring in the organizational context. I think oftentimes we kind of, within the organization, there are pressures, moving on. And I think organizational level scholars oftentimes go, we're a collection of individuals, those people
whatever
over
that
there.
means. Yes.
Right. And the reality is both of those views are important, but if they're not talking to each other, we're missing elements of detail and nuance that can explain, why are some things not working at the organizational level? Well, maybe we need to drill down to the individuals. Or at the individual level, why are things not exactly as we think? Well, maybe the organization or the situation is putting pressures. So I've become more interested, not to say I am not a meso scholar, but I've become more interested in some of the points of intersection and really thinking about, am I giving enough credit to both of those influences in my work?
Right. And, I noticed, sorry.
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I think Abby and Hedy are doing a great job of talking about this difficulty of talking to both sides and trying to integrate. And throughout the review process, they were from all sides, from all reviewers. It was constantly it's really well written, but yet there's too many things going on.
Yes.
There's too many literatures. There's too many ways they're describing it. And it was consistent feedback, but the writing was very good. So that's the struggle with it, right? Because in AMR, you don't have data to help you tell the story. You have to tell it with just the words. And when there's so many words to talk about similar things at different levels, then it's a very difficult process to be able to try to bring that together.
Right. And I can understand as a reader, you don't want to have too many moving parts in the paper, right? Because it just complicates things, makes it harder to follow, makes it harder to get the point. But at the same time, if your point is to bridge across two literatures, or even in this case, across two levels of analysis, aren't you kind of forced to have a fair number of moving parts in the paper? And can't we give some grace for that? My goodness.
Where were you? Why weren't you reviewing them too? I will say, yes. One of the things thinking back on some of the things that eventually ended up helping us, it didn't feel helpful at the time. Hedy, you're going to laugh when I say this. One of my least favorite things that Hedy would say, I'd come to her office and be pulling my hair out and say, I see two options in the way to write this. We could start from this literature, blah, 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 and build to this one. Or we could start with that literature, blah, 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 build to this one. And she would sigh and smile and say, I think you have to write it both ways to see what works out. You just won't know until you write it. So the reality is good chunks of that paper have been written twice. Once coming from one perspective, once coming from the other. And then we would see through our writing, where did that lead and how did it feel? even though it was very time consuming, that ended up being a nice strategy for me to see how things played out. At the time, I stomped my feet. I stomp my feet apparently all the time. That just might be my personality. But another strategy that we used, and I think this came out in our review process, we had lots of examples in our paper, even from the beginning. But pretty early on, one of the reviewers said, I think it was one of the reviewers, it may have been you, Sherry, I'm not recalling directly, but you need a running example, which sounds so incredibly simple until you realize a running example that speaks to both the individual and the collective. And so what we ended up doing was having this one example of a product launch that happens every year for this company. And then we chose different individuals to demonstrate how they might react to that. And I think that through line, that constancy helps the reader to be able to go back and forth to the collective pressure, to the individual interpretation. But it took a while to get that right. I would say every iteration we were still working on that example.
I have never struggled as much with examples as we did on this paper, because our first approach was to be as diverse in our examples as we possibly can. And I think that didn't help the reader follow the plot.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I find that advice of using one example, I tell my doctoral students all the time, and then trying to bring that back in as much as possible, because I think, again, without data, you need to be able to help the reader follow your story. And the more consistent you are throughout, the easier it is for the reader to follow the story.
And I think when you're being complicated in one aspect of the paper, you need to simplify the other aspect.
That's right. But unfortunately, that was a holdover, Rich, from me wanting to talk about temporal schemata at each time frame. Let me give an example of an hour, of a week, of a day, of a year. I wanted to do all of them. And we needed to go, you know what, no, let's simplify and just hold this constant. We have a little bit about that in the beginning, but really once you get into the paper, it's just one example of a product launch that happens every year. Full stop. Would I like to write more papers about the other elements of temporal schemata at different timeframes? Sure, of course. But sometimes you have to be willing to let go of your pet project or elements of your pet project, because it's hindering you from telling the story that you really need to tell. And that's, I like to really do that through a review process. Is, do I need to say this thing to tell this story? Or is it just important to me? And if you ask me, I'll wax poetic about all the different time frames. And this was one of those situations where I had to, kill my darlings.
Yeah, otherwise it risks turning into a Faulkner novel or something like that.
This probably was very close.
We had versions, yes, that resembled that.
Yes, yeah.
But let me share my screen here so that you can take a look at the main figure from the paper. Just give us the elevator pitch for what you're doing here, because this figure kind of illustrates the overall set of propositions and ideas, kind of summarizes the conceptual aspects of the paper. Maybe use this as an opportunity to talk us through what the overall logic of the paper is and why it should be interesting to readers.
Sure, I'll do a real top level, and then if you have additional questions or want to drill down, or Hetty, if you want to add anything, let me know. If we start at the left corner, what we see is that we've got organizational temporal structures. So, routines, schedules. This is where we try to coordinate pace and rhythm, et cetera. And you've got those pressures for coordination, right? That's what organizations are, collections of individuals. We need people to work together and to coordinate their efforts. Below that, then you see the individual temporal schemata, which is individuals' views of time that we talked about. And you see that upward arrow is saying, resistance to inconsistencies, that when the temporal structure that's imposed upon me doesn't seem consistent with my view of time, I'm going to try to, rethink that. Like, why is this going on? Like my 5 to 9 p.m. meeting. So those two things, were kind of established in the literature, the temporal structure versus temporal schemata, although temporal schemata much more in the psychological literature. They were kind of established separately. And we said, actually, it's when those two things come together. So in the gray box, the temporal cognitive affective processing system, we say, when there's an inconsistency, that's going to trigger additional thought here. So that consistency evaluation function. So if there's an inconsistency, so moving to the right, then that's when the cognition and affect come into play. If there's consistency, so if you look at the consistency evaluation function, it just goes directly south. That's automatic entrainment. And that's a lot of what the entrainment literature talks about. So I don't think we necessarily need to talk about that anymore, except to say that just reinforces the temporal structure. That's where the previous literature has been. And we said there's a lot more. So going back to the inconsistency on that, the right corner there, we say, okay, when it's now inconsistent, so the time frame, I'm asked to have a meeting, after hours, it's outside of my work day. The day should end at whatever, 5:30. Now, if I have a really strong temporal schemata, affect might be my first reaction. I'm angry, this is cutting into my personal time, etc. That then takes this cognitive affective processing system, which we adapted to a temporal element, and says, okay, that impacts how I encode things, what expectancies I have, what plans I have, versus if, you're heady, you have less of a strong temporal schemata about the workday. She starts from a more cognitive perspective. This is unusual. We're meeting from 5 to 9. Not a problem. Maybe affect comes from that, maybe not, but she starts with that encoding and then has the rest of those cognitive affective units. So
I'm not even sure Hetty would make it there, right? Because she would be more in this consistent column, right?
I don't know that Hetty would necessarily think of 5 was consistent.
No. Yeah. Hetty did not like meeting after 5 o'clock. No?
Yeah,
so where were you, Hetty?
Would be to not, but I can rationalize it. I can say, okay, this makes sense.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so we've got the if and the then, and that comes from the CAPS system, from that original literature. So if things get triggered for you, if that gets triggered, then you move into this cognitive affective processing system. Then you have either affect or encoding starting that process, and all the goals, expectancies, plans about time. What we added to that literature that then ties it back to entrainment is, depending upon what happens in your cognition and affect, we've got a therefore. So if, then, therefore. So if there's inconsistency, then you have these cognitions and affective reactions, and that's what leads to the therefore. How do you respond? So we have deliberate entrainment. So it looks like entrainment. I'm going to the meeting, right? I'm there. And maybe in this situation with the dotted line, it's a situational exception. Okay, this is once, our dean has said we need to do this only once a year for faculty evaluations when nobody's in the building, et cetera, or this is the only time we can meet. And so,
do this again and I quit, right?
Well, and that's the accumulated exceptions. So I have a choice either if this keeps happening over and over and that accumulates, my choice is either to say, this isn't a good fit for me, or, wow, maybe if I'm going to work in this profession, I need to be more flexible and maybe my day doesn't end at 5. And so that's how individuals can respond. But to the extent that I deliberately entrain, and at least in the short term, I'm reinforcing the current structure, right? I'm not saying anything to my dean. I'm showing up at 5. That's different than the next two, which are much more about resistance. And so passive resistance, and I will totally throw myself under the bus here, which I did think about, was passive resistance would be, maybe I show up at 5, but I say, I'm sorry, I have to leave at 7. I have a family commitment. In some ways, I'm reinforcing that structure. That's the partially reinforced, but in other ways, I'm destroying it. So I'm in training to the beginning of the meeting, but not the ending.
Mm-hmm.
Active resistance could take one of 2 different paths, and that could be, I either say, this isn't appropriate for those of us who have small children, in which case I'm being more constructive, and I actually change. And I say, this temporal structure doesn't work. We should pick something different. Or I could actively resist in a more destructive way and just not show up. Right. And certainly we can see different examples in academia, but also other professions. Star employees oftentimes will take these kinds of tactics because they have high power. And then the last one, which we thought was really interesting, we'll probably write a whole paper just on this one, is that there are situations in which your schemata and your temporal structure may be inconsistent, but inconsistent because not enough cues exist. And so it may be a situation in which, and the evening meeting is as good of an example as it is in the paper with the annual product launch here, but we also theorize that there are times when people create more structure. So they say, look, for me to meet this deadline or for me to coordinate with my team, they're not saying when things should get done, but I'm going to do more. So, maybe it's in our example of the evening meeting, that I don't know, when we'll be comparing information. So I create a schedule for myself in advance of that meeting, and I create even more structure. And what we like about that is it augments the existing temporal structure, which the entrainment literature doesn't really talk about. What's the genesis of what are called Zeitgebers, the time givers? We say these exist and this is what makes entrainment work, but where do they come from? And we say they come from individuals who see an opportunity either to actively resist in constructive ways or actually create completely new structure. So I think I've covered everything in the model. Anything else you want to dive into, Rich?
Well, I did. So 3 things occurred to me as you were talking through this. First of all, just that, in the tension that I mentioned with my family, I have tried every one of these. And and bounce around from one to another, spending perhaps too much time on the passive resistance and the destructive active resistance, perhaps. But I'm not, as I read through your propositions, I was trying to relate it to my own personal family life and my resistance. And I could see that I'm not consistent in the behavioral responses. So there's one aspect there that there's kind of a presumption here that there is a single behavioral response when in fact there may be multiple,
right. And to your point, I think it is situational, as we talked about earlier. So it's not that if you are a resistor, you're always a resistor. It depends. You're evaluating each situation based on how the structure looks relative to your schemata. I think it's interesting you think of that as inconsistency, and I don't know that I would agree with that. I think it would be more disturbing to me if you had the same hammer in every situation and always applied it. Now, our paper didn't go there, so I'm the first to say that we didn't really look at that. Maybe that'd be a great follow-up paper, but it is kind of interesting.
So a second thought I had was with regard to your example of, okay, I'm going to show up at the meeting at 5 o'clock, but I'm going to be done by 7. Mm-hmm. See, and when you talked about passive resistance, initially I thought you meant like, okay, I'll show up at the meeting from 5 to 9, but I'm doing my grading during that time, right? Or I'm reading the newspaper, right? Yeah. I'll be there physically, but I'm not there mentally. I'm doing something else, right?
Passive.
Resistance. Yeah, that's what I thought you meant by passive resistance. What you talked about showing up at 5 but quitting at 7, I would have thought you might call that something more like partial entrainment or something like that.
It could be. I think that passivity could mean different things to different people. I think, so just as Hetty said, that could be another form of passivity. I think what's important about that is to know that, we're talking about the temporal elements. So in many ways, that example, I would almost say, if you're going to do your grading during the meeting, it almost could be construed as deliberate entrainment. So you're still going from 5 to 9, nothing's changing about the structure. By all accounts, everyone's looking and thinking you're entrained. Versus passive, which is oftentimes gets more into, something about these temporal cues don't work for me. And so I may, resist some of them very, very subtly. Mm-hmm. And so, we could have a debate about where your example fits there. But I think what's key here is that, and we talk about this in the paper, the different temporal cues of the beginning, the ending, the duration, the pace. You can be at the meeting and resist, the pace of the meeting, for example. Like you can, why are we taking so long to discuss this issue? This should be moving faster. We'll never get finished at 9 if we don't, push this forward. I did that in a recent meeting. I'm apparently very impatient, and we had this year's faculty evaluation meeting was from, what was it, Hetty, 2 to 6? Okay,
Yeah.
better, more improved. But in looking at the agenda, I just didn't think it should take 4 hours. And I thought the meeting is going to last 4 hours because we have 4 hours. And so I said at the beginning to the person leading it, I bet we could finish today in 3 hours. So that's another form of passive resistance, right? Mm-hmm. I'm at the meeting, I'm there at 2, but I'm saying, hey, could we pick up the pace a little bit here?
That sounds to me like more constructive active resistance of saying, hey, I challenge you to get this done in 3 minutes.
But I think this illustrates that feedback loop really well. So if we go back to, this was before either Abby or I were at TCU, if we're going to stick with this example. If you go back to the original versions of this meeting, it went on for 3 days, literally. Mm-hmm. 3 all-day meetings. And then they got it down to 4 hours. Now we've got it down to what, 3.5.
Yes.
And that's changed, right? The organizational temporal structure.
Yes.
As a result of some individuals like Abby who have these different inconsistencies. And then, there therefore is something that produces a change in that organizational.
Yeah, and I will say, good point, Rich, about, is that passive resistance or active? The reason I think in my mind I characterized it as passive is because I actually made it as a joke to the person who was leading the meeting. I said, hey, before everybody gets on, I have a bet. I bet we're going to be able to finish by 5 instead of 6. I said, but don't tell anybody. So I didn't tell him. I didn't say we need to finish by 5 because 6 o'clock is too late. To me, that's the more active use of voice. You're going out on a limb a little bit more, whereas I was just a little bit more passive. And quite frankly, in the meeting, I'm divulging way too much about my personal meetings here, but in the meeting, was certainly one to make sure that I wasn't prolonging a conversation because I didn't want us to go past 5 o'clock. I also find this conversation comical because I don't stop working at 5. I just don't want to be in meetings at 5 o'clock at night.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a question of, is this distinction between passive and active, is it a matter of motivation, or is it a matter of tactics, right? I don't know. That's up to you guys to decide. The 2 other things occurred to me. One is that like you said, all of the outcome variables in your model are at the individual level, right? They're all behavioral outcomes, right? And yet you said at the beginning, when you were thinking about the project initially, you were thinking about, well, how do we get the organization to change to match the individual's schemata, right? And now the paper turns out to be, how does the individual adapt to the organization? And I guess you could go either way on it, but perhaps maybe
either way.
Pardon?
I think it is either way.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. Did you want to answer that, Hetty?
Well, and I also want to point out, is it because you are more of an individual level researcher that you wound up thinking about, here's the individual's adaptations to the organization? And is that why you also thought about, well, maybe it should be the organization that adapts to the individual?
So here my thought is, number one, of course, yeah, my views of the world are going to come through in whatever work that I do. What I felt like was more interesting here was to look at all the different ways individuals can behave in response to temporal structures. And then it's the feedback loops, to me, back to temporal structure. When are we reinforcing? When are we changing? When are we destroying? When are we augmenting? That's where the organization needs to start raising its eyebrows. And so at the end of the paper, we give a lot of examples in the entrainment literature about situations in which other authors have said, we're not really sure why, but this happened. So let me give you an example. In Perlow, 1999, she talks about, we had these quiet time hours, they were so effective, but when we left, the organization didn't keep them going. And, this norm has returned. And what we would say is, yes, the norm returned, but maybe the issue wasn't that, wow, that norm was so powerful, it overcame the benefits of the quiet time. Maybe the quiet time was just a little bit off. And for one person, it started too early, and for another, it started too late, or for, yet another person, it was just too long. And if we drill down to that individual level from an organizational perspective, we would have been able to understand, why did we not sustain what was a very great temporal innovation that led to increased productivity? So it's really to say, your question, I would push back on you and say, does the individual have to adapt? I don't think so.
No,
I think what some of these outcomes are saying is that many times it's the individual not adapting that creates benefit for the organization. Now it's the organization's responsibility, the leaders of the organization, to say, how are we cultivating views that aren't necessarily reinforcing our structure? That's where temporal innovations come from. And so in our example of, the used to be 3-day meeting, somebody along the way said, this duration is too long. We shouldn't be taking 3 days to evaluate faculty, right? And so our models just says, there's a lot more interesting stuff going on in people's heads. And if we would, stop trying to top down, tell people what the schedule is, we could create a little bit more innovation and opportunity.
So I like that, and that one, the benefit of this piece of the model was you've built in the processing that lead from, okay, there's some inconsistency with my organization, to what am I going to do about it, right? If you want to go the other way to understand, well, what changes take place to the organization's temporal structure, and which ones of them stick and which ones of them don't stick, then I would think, would need something like this at the organizational level, right? You'd need to
I think that's a fair point. Yeah.
The processing system that occurs at the organization level, somewhere along this arrow, that leads back up to the temporal structure, right?
Yeah, I think that could be really interesting. And I think, some of the assumptions that we challenge in our discussion section is that, there's always this assumption that, once entrained, it's hard to change.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not true. I do think there are elements of that, right? So I will forever think of this as an academic. I'm not teaching in the summer. That is just ingrained in my head. I'm not teaching in the summer. I'm doing my research. It's a different schedule. So absolutely, there are some things about entrainment that just reinforce themselves. But to your point, what do organizations do? And you'll see, I every time I say organization, I also say, the leaders of the organization, because that's my view, right? We have multiple people at the top and their own individual schemata. So we could look at the collection of individual schemata, portfolio or profile approach at the top level, and how do they respond to these things?
An organizational process.
Yes. Yeah. There's not just one view.
Yeah. So I like that. So I'm sorry, Hetty, I think I interrupted you a few moments ago. You were going to respond to something that I had said.
I think we covered it in the subsequent conversation.
Oh, okay. Okay, good.
Sorry.
So the last point I was going to ask about this framework is, does this have to be about time at all? I mean, could this be about any aspect of coordination, right? Because you're talking about the organization has some needs, pressures for coordination that applies to individuals, and individuals may resist those pressures. Does it have to be about time? Could this model apply beyond just pressures to coordinate over time? Could it be about other aspects of coordination as well?
So do you mind if I jump in, Abby?
No, go ahead.
So I think you are absolutely right, Rich. And it's one of the reasons that this paper kind of excited me and interested me so much as it developed. Although Abby might argue that what I'm about to say is still about time. But just to take it into my own personal realm. So one of my other areas where I do research is empowerment. and empowering leader behaviors. And there's a growing body of literature that says, right, you shouldn't be empowering all the time. There's times when you need to be more controlling, and there's times where you need to be more empowering, and it's the leader that does the right thing at the right time that gets the best results from employees. And so, right, we also have schemata about that. When is it appropriate for my leader to tell me to do something, and when do they need to back off and stop micromanaging me? And so I guess as I'm saying that now, I'm starting to believe that that's about time too. But my argument is, or I guess my point is that, right, there is entrainment and coordination around all kinds of things that maybe the primary element isn't time, it's something else, but it's still getting everybody on the same page or not, and the consequences of when that happens.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you. And actually, I love that you asked this question, Rich, because these are the things that come up in AMR reviews that make you just absolutely pause and say, is this true? Have I made an assumption that maybe needs to be re-questioned? Or, would this be an entirely new paper? I mean, I don't know. I'd have to think more about that. My initial reaction is that fundamental to the element of coordination is time, right? But that's also my worldview. So it's, when do things begin and end, and what pace and rhythm do they take? So, I'd have to think about that more. I probably couldn't give you a 1-minute answer, but I think it's possible it could apply to other things beyond coordination. I think that would be
or just other aspects of coordination beyond time.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Beyond time. Yeah. Other aspects of coordination that aren't about the temporal structure. Absolutely. I think that's possible. I just, would need to think more about what those examples might be and how it might play out.
Maybe it's self-evident, but who's the target audience for this paper? Who should read it?
So initially me. I feel like all of my papers start with, I want to figure something out. It's bothering me. I want to figure something out. Obviously, I don't write for me. So this paper in the end is, I think, speaks to two audiences. One, obviously, entrainment and coordination scholars. Please take account more of the individual variation within a collective. But also there's a growing body of research that is looking at temporal issues. And so, looking at how people think about time, how they use time, whether individually or collectively, that is getting drawn into every other domain. And I think it's really important that there's some theory to underlie those conversations and extensions of other theories and empirical work. I think those budding temporal scholars, whether they consider themselves primarily temporal scholars or somebody who's just bringing time into their domain, really digging into this subjective interpretive element of what time means to people.
Nice. Okay.
Can I jump in?
Please. Absolutely.
Because I think I would like to just say a general comment about the review process on this particular paper. And if part of what we're doing here is trying to demystify kind of what happens in this process. And I would say this paper was particularly challenging because the reviewers were very strident in their views. And there was one particularly very negative reviewer, not negative in the comments, because the comments were very strong, I think, in good comments, but just kind of like, no, there's nothing new here. And I had to keep kind of checking myself and going, okay, I know this person is prominent in the field and has this very strong view, but I really like it. Like, I really feel like every time I read that version of the paper that I'm learning something and it's taking strides and moving forward. And so really trying to balance the feedback I was getting from the reviewers and trying to say, how is it that I can take some of these comments and really help to guide you? Because I know there's that nugget, and the nugget's getting bigger. It's something really important that we need to investigate. But I also need to balance the comments and expertise of the reviewers. And so it was challenging, but I think it was well worth it because we have this wonderful paper at the end of it. And I think you guys for actually taking on the challenge of responding to those reviewers and really coming back time and time again to try to be more clear and concise with what you're trying to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't say enough about the quality of the reviews that we got. I mean, every round were thorough and pushed us and that's been my experience. Everything that I've published at AMR, the paper gets better as a result of the reviews. Sometimes at other journals, you'll find like, oh, we had to go in this direction. That's not really what we wanted to say, but we had to add it to appease this reviewer. Every AMR I've published has gotten exponentially better than my original vision because of the quality of the editor's remarks and the review team's comments. But yes, was it challenging? It was. I'm going to be the first to admit, I have cried in this review process thinking I can't do this. In fact, Sherry and Rich know this, that, you know, one of the From the Editors columns that we're going to write in a future issue is about this theoretical mindset and the psychological experience of going through tough reviews. Can I do this? How will I do this? You know, to me, if you can get there, that's the exciting part, is they see something that I don't yet see. They're asking me to not just take one step forward, but about 20 steps forward. How do I build myself to get to that spot? You know, meanwhile, I have no idea where that capacity is going to come from. But when you get there, then it's so incredibly fulfilling to go, wow, look what I did. And look what this review team helped me to do. I think that's my only complaint. I wish I could know who these 3 reviewers were so that I could say, thank you. Thank you for sticking with the paper. Thank you for pushing us in ways that we didn't even know we were capable of taking the paper. Because I really, you know, I could say that to Sherry, and I have multiple times over the course of the last few years, but to the review team, I mean, wow, what a gift you gave us that we ended up with this paper.
Well, and maybe Sherry can make sure that the reviewers have a chance to view this video so that they can hear it from you directly. Hattie, do you have any comments on the review process at AMR?
It's funny. I think, and this is not like me, I was much more optimistic about it than Abby was, and it was challenging. I will say every AMR revision process that I've been through, those are my top difficult revision processes that I've been through. But exactly as Abby said, the quality of the contents between the action editor and the reviewers is just so phenomenal. And I felt like because of the way they were pushing us, I was kind of confident that we were going to get there in the end. And it's
especially
funny
when you asked Abby to write it both ways, right?
Yeah.
So there is a second version of this paper somewhere on Abby's hard drive.
We're publishing that one in another journal. No.
Yeah.
You know, the paper that's published looks absolutely nothing. I think there's 2 words in common, time and temporal schemata, between what we originally submitted. But let me also just be very clear that this paper was not written by the reviewers. It's not that they pushed an agenda on us and we conformed to that agenda. It's that they did push us to take what we have and really turn it into something.
Very true.
And Abby is absolutely right. That gift is beyond compare.
Mm-hmm.
Final question, and I'll throw this out to all 3 of you. What impact do you hope that this paper will have in the future in terms of its influence either on future theory or on future empirical research or on future practice or perhaps even on future policy?
So I'll start. And the answer, I think, applies to multiple domains that you talked about there. But, you know, one of the things is this, you know, view of leaders really considering an individualized interpretation of time. I know for myself as a department chair, I think a lot about this, you know, not just when I schedule meetings, but, you know, when I contact people, if sending emails on a Sunday, is that creating the wrong signal that, you know, because what I've noticed is I get caught up on a Sunday afternoon and now all of a sudden everybody's getting caught up on a Sunday afternoon. And then everybody is now entrained to actually trading emails on a Sunday afternoon. And now Sunday's a work day. So I've done things as a leader to actually, get caught up, but not send the emails until Monday because of that signaling and really, thinking about there are different people in my department that may have different views of time. So what I hope is that could come into future theory at the organizational, collective, or team level to account for individual levels of time, and that practically leaders would consider. So as Hetty mentioned, that sometimes as a leader you do one thing, sometimes you do another. It's really important to not just think about the timing at the leader level or at your unit level. Think about within your unit. So I have approximately 20 faculty that work in my department. That's complex to think about what works for one person and doesn't for another. But that's meaningful because that's where those people start from. In terms of policy, would I love us to go to some sort of policy like France where you can't send emails after certain hours or on certain weekends? I would. I'm a big believer in the value of respite and psychological detachment from work. I think there's so much strong evidence there that I think we really need to pay attention to that. But I don't that I'm yet ready to go to the Capitol to create some policy on that. But give me 10 years. I may increase my aspirations.
Yeah, well, I can imagine some situations where that wouldn't work, right? If you're having a major malfunction during Apollo 13, I think giving people a day off would probably be a bad idea.
Yeah, but last I checked, most of us don't work in rocket science, so right. I think we're safe.
Fair enough. How about you, Hetty? What do you think about in terms of the potential future impact of this paper on theory, empirics?
A slightly different direction, and starting also from where this started with me. As I said at the beginning, I was not really, I didn't have a really in-depth knowledge of time and hadn't really given it as much thought as, of course, now I have when we started this paper. And I think what I would hope to see is I hope that micro researchers who have this idea that, or even macro researchers, this idea that when you introduce temporal issues into your research, you've got a time 1 and a time 2, or a time 3 or a time 4, that there is so much more to understanding the role of time and the phenomena that we study. And so that, even if you're not interested in entrainment and coordination, if you can, and certainly ours is the only paper that does this, but if you can look at it and go, okay, now I understand why start, stop, duration, pace, and how individuals respond to these actually matter. I think that will help people design more meaningful research that really does truly incorporate time other than just a time lag between data collection.
Nice. How about you, Sherry? Do you have a perspective on the future impact of a paper like this?
Yeah, so from a kind of the journal editor perspective, I think this paper is super valuable for both time researchers. It's just kind of here is one of the papers you need to read in order to understand our understanding of time and how it affects both individuals, organizations, and those together. I also think it's a great paper to look at as sort of a template if you're interested in trying to integrate micro and more macro level phenomena and how you might do those kinds of things. I hope people listen to this video, because I think that even talking through the process may give authors a better understanding of some of the challenges and things they need to think about as they're trying to create a meso model type of situation, regardless of the topic area.
Nice. Well, ladies, thank you very much for being my guest on the AMR Origin series today. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you about this paper, about the AMR review process, and about demystifying the theory development process. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Hetty.
Yeah, thank you all for both being here. It was awesome.
Thank you.
My pleasure.